So in this shorter video, I want to talk about the relationship between arguments and form. Because we're going to see the kind of shape of an argument or the structure of the argument has a very close relationship to whether it's valid or not. So like we often do, I'm going to start with some examples, because before I really tell you what we mean or define what we mean, it's easier to see examples of it first and then think about it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example of two arguments with the same form. So one will say is if David Boylan is in Lubbock, he's in Texas. That's the first premise. The second premise is David Boylan is in Lubbock. And the final premise is he's in Texas. Okay, so we've seen a bunch of arguments like this before. We know that this argument is valid. Let me give you another example of an argument with the same form. Let's say if Ross is a professor and Joey is an actor. Let's say Ross is a professor so Joey is an actor. Move that so you can see. If you compare them, it's clearly in some sense, these are the same kind of argument. Now they're about different things. It's not that they have the same subject matter. This one is about me and where I live and so on. This one is about Ross and Joey and what they do for money and things like that. So it's not about like what the arguments are about. The arguments are about completely different things. But nonetheless, they have the same form. The way that they're put together out of their parts is the same, even though they have different parts. So if you think about it, you can kind of see what the form of the argument is. And any argument with the same form is going to be the same with respect to validity. The connection is if two arguments have the same form, then they're either both valid or neither are valid. You can't have two arguments of the same form where one is valid and the other isn't. So that's an argument where they're both valid and you see that they have the same status. But it's good to see a pair of invalid arguments of the same form and check that the same holds there. So to do that, I'm just going to move around the bits of the argument a little bit. I'm going to change the premise. So here I'm going to say David Boylan is in Texas. And I'm going to change the conclusion to he's in Lubbock. So hopefully, as you can recognize by now, this argument is not valid when I switch things around. And the reason is because, well, even if I'm in Texas, obviously there are other places I could be apart from Lubbock. So that's an invalid argument. Let's change this one around in the same way. So we'll say that Joey is an actor. And Ross is a professor. So this is also an invalid argument. It's a little bit harder to see. One reason to see you could think about this is like you could think, well, maybe whether Joey is an actor has no bearing at all on whether Ross is a professor. Suppose Joey decided, well, whether or not Ross is going to be a professor, I'm going to become an actor. He decided, regardless of what would happen, he would become an actor. Then this would be true, because if it's true one way or the other, then it's true in one way. And it's also true that Joey's an actor. But we could also maybe add, contrary to what actually happens in Friends, of course, we could add the supposition that Ross is not a professor. So this is also an invalid argument if you think about it. Maybe a little bit hard to see, but you can think, but it can be seen. Notice again that these two arguments are of the same form. Even though they're about different things, they sort of have the same structure. And again, we see that with respect to validity, they have the same status. They're both invalid this time. So in general, when two arguments are of the same form, they're either both valid or neither is valid. This is actually a really good thing for us because it means that instead of having to think about every argument each time, we can just think about in general, more generally, the kinds of argument. We don't really have to think about particular arguments. We don't have to check. Once we know that this one is invalid, we see that this one is the same form. We don't even really need to think about it because it's like, well, if they're valid, they're both valid. And if one is invalid, they're both invalid. So learning whether this one is valid or not immediately tells you whether this one is valid or not. So that's why this idea of form is so important. There's a tight connection between validity and form. And if we want to know whether an argument is valid, we really just need to think about its form. And once we figure out whether that argument form is valid or not, then we know whether any argument of that form is valid. So it really cuts down our work. What we're going to do for the rest of this lecture is we're going to figure out exactly what do we mean when we say they're of the same form? Can we pin down what exactly that form is? It turns out there actually is a very nice and easy way to pin down the form of an argument. But before we do that, we need to introduce some other notions.